Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Gigi and from the George Washington University's Rodham Institute, where we are dedicated to improving health equity through action. We're not about studying health equity. It's been studied to death. We want to do things and make sure that we are part of the solution in partnership with all of the wonderful community organizations as well as the community leadership. I was at the groundbreaking, I can't even keep track because of the 3-day weekend, last week with the new Cedar Hill hospital in Southeast. And I'm very excited about it because the idea is that it's going to be an integrated healthcare system where services that have not been traditionally available to the good people of Southeast will finally be made available, such as prenatal care, OBGYN care, labor and delivery, wound care, a trauma center, neurology. Those are just some of the things. Also, Whitman Walker Health, on which I'm on the board of as well, also is opening up an integrated healthcare system. It's actually going to be opening 2023, whereas the Universal GW Hospital is going to be opening up in 2024. I wanted to tell you what really stood out for me at the groundbreaking. Of course, everybody's kind of doing their usual thing, but the great, 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 great grandson of Frederick Douglass was there. And he taught me something that I had never known before. And that is apparently Anna Douglass, who's Frederick Douglass's wife, was really instrumental in freeing him. It was through her money and that she said to him, I don't want my children born to a slave. I want to make sure that, you are a free man. And it was her actually that planted the seeds in terms of his thinking and got him to be the great orator, the great activist that he was. He also shared something that I didn't know. When it looked like things were heating up, in the United States, and Frederick Douglass was going to be recaptured and re-enslaved, Ireland took Frederick Douglass in. And he was there for a couple of years. And, they still to this day, every single year on his birthday, they have a conference, they do talks, they do discussions. So I just want to give a shout out to Ireland as well. And I think that this is just a great segue into our guest this evening. And we'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen. But just to kind of put the framework before we introduce him, and of course, Ms. Ashanti Carter, who's the program manager, and she's the one that actually puts these wonderful webinar series together. I don't know if people have gone to the African American Museum yet. I have to share with you, the first time I went, I couldn't make it through the slave ship, which was down, that's the lowest level in the museum. I couldn't. I mean, part of it is that I have a very strong capacity to visualize people, and it was just too much for me. It took me the second time that I went there. And so I think it's important from a health equity standpoint, because that's what we focus on, to really understand how the members of the African diaspora got here, how these traumatic conditions have actually been embedded in their DNA, how these kinds of this awful traumatic event has actually continued for 400 years, which is the legacy of slavery. And when we think about, what are the things that impact health equity, education is one. I'm going to share one more sort of anecdote. Our friends, Dr. Kirkland Vaughn and Dr. Warren Spielberg, who we actually had at one of our summits, they actually co-authored a 2-volume book on Black boys and the psychology of Black boys and teens. And they shared one anecdote, which I thought was so important. And that is, when you tell a child that your ancestors were enslaved, they kind of deflate. But when you tell that same child, they were slaves, sorry, they were slaves, they deflate. But when you tell that same child that actually your ancestors were enslaved and brought here against their will, the kids actually act very differently. So with that as kind of a background and sort of my personal points of view, I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Stephen. And on this webinar series, we're very informal. I hate to do long introductions because I think it's important that our speaker actually introduce himself, because he'll point out what the important things that we need to know about that. So without further ado, Dr. Stephen, welcome. We are so excited to hear about this topic this evening. So please, I'm going to toss it to you, and please take it away.
So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be asked or to be invited to have this conversation with those of you at the Rodham Institute. Health equity is something that is, of course, rooted in historical conditions. And the Shipwrecks project that I'm one of the co-founders and currently co-director on, really is about looking into this history, but more than that, understanding how this history continues to live today, and to think of ways in which to address that. Now, we do this more in the historical arena as a maritime archaeologist is what I'll be talking a little bit about today, I think, in that capacity. And but I've also worked as a cultural anthropologist, and I would just, this is the project is an interesting opportunity to bring the recovery of the past into dialogue with questions about social justice in the present. And I would just, flag this is kind of a sad day for those of us who are cultural anthropologists, having just lost Paul Farmer, who I think is somebody who really paved the way in terms of thinking about, in my discipline, certainly about health equity, but about broader questions about how the past in places like Haiti resonates in terms of the challenges of social equity and justice today. And in a small way, I'm hoping that the Shipwrecks project, which is a global project, can play its own role in bringing the past into dialogue with the present. It's a very large and complicated project, but perhaps the best way to introduce it would be with the video that was produced by our partners at the Smithsonian, by then the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, where the slave ship exhibit of San Jose. This video will explain a little bit about where some of those artifacts come from. And of course, Lonnie Bunch has gone on and is now the director of the entire Smithsonian. So have an opportunity to hear his perspective on this as well. So without further ado, let me introduce the project through this one particular effort that has been undertaken halfway around the world, but where the artifacts now sit just a few blocks away.
The company arrived at this remote place when the wind rose in such a way from the southeast that it was impossible to enter here in the Table Bay like it is normal in this case.
The company, in the greatest anxiety, waited for the arrival of the day, threw the anchor, and found themselves run aground on two rocks.
They therefore sent a boat of slaves to the shore, which arrived safely, but because of a dangerous surf, it could not return.
The ship broke to pieces, through which they afterwards found out that 212 slaves, which tried to save themselves, died.
The San Jose was a Portuguese slave vessel on the way back from Mozambique with a cargo of slaves. the shipwreck and our Cape of Storms, and just lay there for about 200 plus years before we rediscovered the wreck.
To our knowledge, this is the first full-scale effort to document a shipwreck of a ship that was carrying slaves.
It's so important because it can lead us to a host of information about what happened to those on board. Is important because it also allows us to recover the memories of those who were held as less than human underneath the bowels of the ship.
Talking about the Middle Passage has taken on almost mythical proportions. The number of people who were lost, the tragedy in terms of what happened to Africa.
We think the San Jose story is critical, very, very important, critically important to the story of humanity, actually. It really sort of touches anybody's soul.
The slave trade is really one of the first and one of the clearest examples of how global considerations have ultimately shaped not only what happened in Africa, but also what happens in the New World.
The image that most people have of a shipwreck is that of the Titanic. The vast majority of shipwrecks don't look like that at all.
The ship broke up completely, so there's very little that you can see that actually tells you it's a shipwreck. So you've got to look very carefully. There's one or two bits of timber, and then the ballast blocks that we've recovered most of, and mostly sand.
To participate in a dive is quite thrilling because when an object is found, you are first-hand there, you get to see where it's found, the context it's in, and you just get to go up on board and say, oh, we found an artifact.
What really sort of moved me and gave me a sense of where I actually was and what actually happened at this site was Tara took us around these rocks, and there it was sort of embedded in the seabed, and enlarged between these rocks was a huge wooden member. This was my first visual of the San Jose, where so many people had lost their lives. I know it might sound a bit esoteric, but when I touched that wooden member, it's like I was hearing the voices and feeling the souls of those individuals that perished there. And I knew then that I wanted to work this project and really help tell the story of the San Jose.
For us archaeologists, even the smallest artifact can give us a clue into the story of the shipwreck. I mean, something as small as the pulley block can tell us about the type of vessel, where it was possibly used, how it was possibly used. The ballast tells us a story about the shipwreck. It can give us a date for a shipwreck.
Iron ballast was often used and carried in these ships, both as a trade item to trade for slaves, but also because there was a need to weight down the ship because human bodies were not as heavy as other types of cargo. So it's a signature.
I felt that it was really important to find some relics that would allow people to not imagine the enormity, but imagine the slave trade in a very personal way.
This started as a project that was looking at a shipwreck site, but it's grown beyond that.
What began as a search for a single ship defines an arc and a trajectory across the globe and across history that unveils a new way of looking at the slave trade, and it unveils a new way of operating for museums and research institutions in the 21st century.
Because it's an international project, we get to dive with people that we would normally not dive with, and I quite enjoy that part of it.
I think the collaboration is powerful because it brings this diversity of perspective. You know, you got Africans in Africa, and you got African Americans in America that has totally different cultural experiences now, but we're converging on this common project that ties us and binds us together.
This is the last frontier when it comes to exploring the Middle Passage.
Wow. So, Dr. Stephen, take us through a little bit of history. This particular slave ship started where, and tell us about the people that were on this ship. Where did they come from? What, if any, sort of history, their history?
Yeah, so this slave ship, when we first started to look for it, we had one footnote in a report that said that a Portuguese vessel carrying slaves had sunk. They actually sort of gave the wrong reference. It was a more general reference. And so the research over the years, which has involved teams of researchers from South Africa, the US, Brazil, Mozambique, United Kingdom, we've been able to ascertain that the enslaved were brought from different areas within the interior of Mozambique, most likely Makua speakers, also from the interior in Tet. And in fact, a very unusual situation. We have a letter that has allowed us to identify what we think is actually one of the ringas in the interior that the enslaved actually came from. That likely on this vessel, it's sort of a strange story. This is occurring at a time when Portugal had abolished slavery within Portugal, but the Portuguese crown was deeply implicated in the slave trade, nevertheless, to Brazil. And in fact, the San Jose, as far as we know, was the first time that a ship was coming from East Africa towards the Americas, towards Brazil, legally under the protection of the Portuguese crown. But for a variety of different reasons, we were able to ascertain that, in fact, a portion of the slaves on this vessel were probably actually ones that had been enslaved and given to the Portuguese crown. And this is, so we were able to locate a couple areas from the interior. Of course, half of those who were on this vessel, they would have been on the vessel for at least 5 or 6 weeks before it arrived in Cape Town. And of course, that wasn't its destination. Its destination was Maranhão, Brazil. The shipwreck event has its own set of documentation. It's really quite, it's an exercise in cognitive whiplash, because you read an account in which the captain says all the people were saved, and yet 212 died, and just over 204, I believe, survived. But that term, the people, was reserved for the crew. And I think what is so shocking in reading through this, they say the past is a different country, is it's not a marked, it's simply a matter of fact, the way it's said, right? Thank God the people were saved. Mm-hmm. And of course, half of those who were on board did not survive. One of the ongoing efforts in South Africa is to try to locate and see if through historical and archaeological research we're able to identify any of the descendants of those who were re-enslaved, because we know they were sold back into enslavement. 12 actually died. In what is today Iziko Museums of South Africa, the Slave Lodge has become, I think, appropriately enough, is the centerpiece for the exhibit that is the equivalent to that of the Smithsonian here, to tell the story that has been recovered in South Africa itself. It's a story that resonates with a very specific history and story that post-apartheid South Africa is wrestling with, right? It has its own particularities, but there's something very powerful about the fact that the San Jose is located in Camps Bay, which is arguably probably the the most expensive piece of real estate on the South African, on the African continent, and there is a link between the racial and economic differences that we see in South Africa today and this history. And I think that it's a very powerful, it provides a very powerful point of entree for reckoning with the present that has come out of this type of past in South Africa itself. But so we are still in the process of trying to see if we can locate descendants in South Africa. And interestingly enough, we were interested, the San Jose was the first, and it was the failed attempt to come from East Africa to Brazil. And that's very important because the switching from West Africa to East Africa prolonged the slave trade for another 50 years. It brought another 1.5 million people into enslavement. And there's a complex history there in which the British were working to abolish the slave trade on the west coast of Africa. And in fact, there's therefore the shift to East Africa as a source of enslavement, and in which America actually plays a very important role. American flags were crucial during this time period because they were the only flags after the War of 1812 that the British would not interdict. And so you would have people, the sort of episodes of our history that have been forgotten, right, in the ways in which the United States was complicit in this. People say East Africa. How is that related? Well, it's very closely related. And the U.S. had a very major role. We know the same year as the San Jose, we have, I think, within 2 years on either side, we have records of slave ships sailing to Charleston and to Savannah and elsewhere. Right.
Wow.
So I think one of the things that has been really amazing is in the wake of the San Jose, we know that other ships in the next few years did make it to Maranhão, to Brazil. And some of our work there, our Brazilian colleagues have been able to identify people by name, literally by name, who arrived from Mozambique and are working to try to find sites of quilombolas, communities that came together after the end of slavery that are related to, in the broadest sense, to this story. And it's interesting how this story of the San Jose then ties into other stories that are also, that have different shipwrecks as point of entree, but tell us, shine a light on this history in different ways. So it's a very long, it's one of the things that I always tell people is that, we may have started on a site in South Africa, but the story is one in which the site itself becomes redefined. As you follow the story and as you follow the stakeholders, it extends from Mozambique to our engagement currently in Portugal, trying to sort of bring this history back into memory in a place that in some sense is suffering from a form of social amnesia, to Brazil, and then of course to the United States.
Yeah. Well, before I turn things over to Ms. Carter, a couple of sort of observations. I've just learned from you that East Africa was a source of, people being, of course, taken against their will and enslaved. But I think it's interesting, and I think it's very important that you, as a marine, archaeologist, and as a cultural anthropologist, bring sort of those two disciplines together, because as Lonnie Bunch said in the video, when you're hearing millions of people, I mean, we can't get our heads around that. But when we hear individual stories, especially if we can trace people's descendants and the specific town that people have come from, that really makes it a much more, sort of real reality, and actually the deprivation and the injustice and the cruelty of it pops, and the sad thing is, of course, now the talk about whitewashing of the curriculum and the knowledge. So it's a confluence of several very interesting things. But on the other hand, it's just bringing to life this story that I don't think can be retold enough times. Ms. Carter, I'm going to switch things to you, and I'll be quiet.
No, this is a co-moderation. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen. What I wanted to ask is this. You spoke about this story, but why is it so important for us to know about this particular story and the United States complicitness in slavery? Because we hear, the lip service, oh, that was so long ago. Forget about it. Get over it. Why should we know? Why should we care?
Wow. So we have 1 hour? No, I think that's a question we hear often, right? And I'm going to try to take a few steps into it, right? But I'd be interested in hearing from others who are on this call as well. One of the things that I think is remarkable is the way in which the story of the slave trade and of enslavement is sort of contained and siloed in history, right? As if it was a episode that ended, with the Civil War, and that, or that, it was unrelated to other things that were going on. And recently, I think with the some of the work that's been going down with the 1619 Project and others, we've been getting a chance to look a little bit in a different way at our history, right? And to understand the ways in which enslavement is not sort of a separate leg of history. It's ubiquitous. And I try to draw this analogy, and I don't know if it's strong enough. At least it resonates. My daughter's 16, and so she's not aware of what the world was like before cell phones and computers. But what is it that you can talk about that does not rely nowadays on computers and cell phones, right? They're so thoroughly and ubiquitously intertwined into everything. The humanities, the arts, and what we don't realize is the way in which enslavement was very similar for several hundred years. You can't talk about maritime trade or the American Revolution. You can't talk about any of these things without understanding how important enslavement was. And literally, if we're talking about who literally built this country, literally built this country, right? And the ways in Lonnie Bunch talks about the fact that there was more wealth held in enslaved persons than in all other industries combined on the eve of the Civil War. If you want to, was enslavement simply something that was happening in the South? Well, when Charleston, Fort Sumter happened and South Carolina declared its independence, the mayor of New York suggested that New York should go along with South Carolina. Why? Because the financial system in New York was so dependent on enslavement, and they saw things differently when those in the South decided to default on their debts. But it was not a matter of principle in many ways. So the complicity, one of the things that's one of the ways in which the United States was complicit, I think I've already talked about that, very briefly. It's our flag and our ships were used in order to evade efforts to abolish the slave trade for 50 years, even though it was illegal in the United States. So a different story that we're currently pursuing is one of the last slave ships to arrive in Brazil in 1858. This is at the very end of the slave trade, it was piloted by a captain from Maine. So this is a shipwreck that we're currently in the process of working with Brazilian colleagues to identify. And what is amazing is he was tried in New York, as 300 other captains had been for piracy since 1808, and all of the others had gotten off. Right, the system was rigged, and he had a mistrial, and then 2 months later, Abraham Lincoln came into office, and when he went to trial again, he became the only person ever who was hanged for this crime that hundreds of other captains on hundreds of other U.S. ships. And I think, sometimes when I give presentation of the Slave Wrecks Project, these different shipwrecks provide us with an opportunity to introduce stories that speak to the broader history that has been forgotten. It's been forgotten, the complicity of the United States in prolonging the slave trade and this tie to East Africa that brought 1.5 more million in. It's been forgotten that we had, if I talk about a ship carrying 75 enslaved that sank on the Ohio River in 1828, it's been forgotten that we had an internal slave trade where more than 500,000 people were brought to North America in the slave trade, but between 1808 and 1860, 1.2 million were shipped from those ports of Alexandria, Baltimore, Annapolis, Richmond, to the Deep South, to what is called second slavery. So I think part of what we seek to do is to identify opportunities to pursue individual stories, but these stories provide us with, they force open sort of a broader history and a broader reckoning. And I think sometimes these stories can be very, they also bring to life other things like resistance and resilience. So I won't deviate too far, but just to foreshadow another story out of Mozambique in I might get this wrong, but it's 1820s, I believe. A young man was taken, 2 young men were taken from Inhaca Island to Brazil, and an American diplomat intervened and actually lost his career because American diplomacy at the time was about protecting American interests and the American flag. But he essentially sacrificed his career to liberate these 2 young men, and they came to Maine. And Pedro Tucoval, we've been able to find where it is that he's buried, but remarkably, we don't just have a name, we have 2 pieces of art that this young man in the 1830s painted, including a wall-size picture of his experience of being freed in Brazil and coming to America. And I think that sometimes I would love to say we planned that, but we didn't. But sometimes because you're doing this research, you are able to bring stories to life and to bring the stories of individual people, and his paintings speak for himself. Our job is to be prepared when we find these voices to place them in a place where people who think such voices couldn't possibly exist anymore, or have been permanently lost, as millions were, to put those voices on a platform and allow them to speak as much as they can for themselves.
One of the questions that was in the Q&A, I don't know if it's Dr. Engel or Ms. Engel, do you have any recommendations for books or articles that focus on the East African trade?
I absolutely. I think and I would say that there are 2 East African trades, right? There's an East African trade that is coming across the transatlantic, and there's a trade in the Indian Ocean that is vast. And Richard Allen and Pedro Machado are two, and Edward Alpers. But I'd be glad to share that sort of
Yeah.
a list, and then anybody who's interested, as well as those who may be interested, for example, in the internal slave trade. I live on the outskirts of Warrenton, Virginia, and which was the epicenter of the internal slave trade. And barring maybe somebody in the historical society, nobody knows his history. It's forgotten.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it needs to be addressed, because it's also at the roots of all sorts of current day conditions and relations and injustices.
Absolutely.
Yes, please, Ms. Carter.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. One more question for you, Dr. Stephen. You spoke about your work and how it's led to conversations in other countries, but I wanted to know, has your work led to any kind of policy changes regarding civil rights movements, either here or abroad?
I think that's a great question. I think, I would say my response to that would be, I hope so. I think that we are, as a maritime archaeologist, bad pun, but small fish in a large sea. But I think what we're interested in is from where we're coming, from how can we, how is it, what can we bring to the conversation? So part of what we do is the research. Part of what we do, and just as important, is how we do the research. So if you look at maritime archaeology, who participates in telling the story, right? Who's received the training? So over the last 8 years that the project's been active, one of our primary goals, we actually started out in South Africa and Mozambique before we came back in some sense across the Atlantic, and have been involved also in supporting work down in Alabama with the Clotilde, which was the last slave ship to arrive here and elsewhere, is to really build the capacity of institutions in Africa to participate in a meaningful and sustainable way in this research and in telling this story. So there now is a center in Mozambique. There is an active program that has been significantly reinforced at these eco-museums of South Africa. There is a up and coming program in Senegal. There's interest in places like Angola and in Cuba and in, as I said, in Brazil. And so, we really want to model sort of a different approach. It's not we come in, we do the research, and then we go away. And that's really how a lot of research gets done, not just in archaeology. I've worked for 20 some years in Angola, and Mozambique, and South Africa, and Liberia. But how is it that we really create the capacity for African institutions to play, African and diaspora institutions to play a role? And so I think, I look at people like Cesar and Celso, who 8 years ago did not know how to swim and were undergraduates, and now have finished their masters in maritime archaeology and wanted pursuing their PhDs, and are instructors in maritime archaeology, in probably the most important maritime archaeology and heritage program in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that is as important as the research is how are we building the capacity to do that. We work here. I would encourage those of you who are interested in this to pick up the March issue of National Geographic. And on the cover, you'll see the story of Diving with a Purpose. And Diving with a Purpose is a subset of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. And these are professionals who work in things, literally rocket science and engineers and so forth, who are interested in diving and then have become interested in maritime archaeology and work with us and have been trained to do work in archaeology. And there's a whole young cadre of young African-American archaeologists starting to come online, and Haitian archaeologists. And I think that is just as important as the research itself, is how are we trying to transform a field and the practice of research Um, so these are, these are sort of different aspects of the slave rights project, but ones that represent what we know we can do, right? Are we changing human rights policy? Are we changing? I don't know, but I think that you have to look around where you are and what you have and what your skill set is and say, how am I contributing? And this is how we're trying to do it.
Well, I think just understanding the history is certainly a first step that I think is crucial, because if we continue sort of what you're saying, there's also the African liberation movements that happened in the 50s and 60s. I mean, you bring up Portugal and Angola and, et cetera, et cetera. So it's logical. It's a logical sort of trajectory. And, I want to kind of bring it to health equity. I'm going to make sure that your question, Dr. Merrill, is asked. But I do want to add, or at least comment about how this has resulted in such disparities, such great disparities. And I have to tell you, I had a patient today that I can tell you about, a woman, African-American woman, who has a history of blood clots, has been complaining of shortness of breath. She has a history and is not what was seen elsewhere and is not having that problem attended to. So this idea of seeing people as less than has really embedded and infiltrated the very fabric of our institutions. And we see that over and over and over again, whether it's, violence from the police and how, people get treated or mistreated, certainly in the health space, in the educational space. And so, these issues are affecting lives today. And actually, the numbers on some level may be even greater because there are more people. And you mentioned South Africa, and obviously we're familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation, project that Desmond Tutu and others led. And of course, there are still problems in South Africa, which we know about. But at the same time, we refuse here in the United States, just refuse. And now there's actually a group that is hell-bent on just not discussing any quote unquote negative history. So it's certainly bothersome. This kind of ties into Dr. Merrill's question, and that is in terms of the capacity building, whether it is in the shipwrecks slave project that you're involved in, but also just in general in terms of the education. This is my piece, the education question. How are HBCUs involved, and are they involved?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think the answer to that is that HBCUs are starting to become more involved through the Society for Black Archaeologists. So one of the interesting things is when this project started out, there was, to my knowledge, there was not a single either African or African-American maritime archaeologist, right? And that says something predominantly about the field. Those of us who co-founded the project saw that, but we also, one of the remarkable things is if you look, the transatlantic slave trade database has been put together by historians over the last 30 years, as of a decade ago, had over 35,000 voyages. I mean, this is the most important maritime process. It's a cornerstone of the modern world in some sense. And yet at the time, there were more studies of cogs in bogs in Ireland than there were of the slave trade, much as the lack of diversity in the professional field, the lack of attention to this is predominantly an indictment of the field, right? It's not, and so, of course, this has to start with those who are willing to, to step into it. And so hence, rather than sort of a full-time maritime archaeologist from Texas A&M, which is sort of the best you get somebody like myself, who is a maritime archaeologist and a cultural anthropologist. But I think what we have sought to do is to expand and find ways to diversify the field. And the Society for Black Archaeologists, which is a forum that of course intersects with HBCUs, but not only HBCUs, right? And then of course institutions in Africa, like IFAN and UCAD and Eduardo Mondlane University and University of Cape Town, University of Western Cape. These are all institutions that are not necessarily HBCUs, but of course are representative African institutions. You know, these are the institutions that we're trying to work with and to try to reinforce. Although I would add too that I think it's important. You know, one of the things that is important is that we realize that this history is, in some sense, a history. There are different stakeholders in this history, right? Those who are in Africa, those who are in the diaspora. But one of the things I'm always concerned with is that we, you know, those of us, such as myself, I'm not African American, I'm not African, but we should not take that as an excuse for not investigating and being involved in this history. This history, the history of enslavement and its legacy, you know, is one that should not be sort of contained and put to the side. It needs to be one that is engaged with across the board, that is in some sense brings those of us who are not African American, non-African into the conversation as well. And we realize that there's a need to be involved. So I think, yes, our emphasis is on building capacity in the African and the diasporan community, but we also want all of those who I want every maritime archaeologist to be thinking about how does the slave trade matter for what I'm doing, and how does it make me rethink what I'm doing as well.
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's important, first of all, to have diversity, because you have different points of view, and not just diversity in the narrow sense of the melanin content of one's skin, but rather diversity in the lens that you're seeing and analyzing things. And just as it's important for us to learn about the Holocaust and learn about the, you know, the awful atrocities that were carried out, it is also important to think about the Armenian genocide, the indigenous peoples here in the, you know, North American hemisphere, and really to understand what those links are, because it is about fascism, it is about racism, but it's also about the economics of it, right? Which I think sometimes gets left out in the discussion. And the violence, I mean, violence, and how are these issues informing us right now, here today, because we've not dealt with these issues. Ms. Carter, and then I think there may be a question on the chat. Please go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead,
Could I just add? I just wanted to, because I didn't want to forget something that you I think you both mentioned earlier, is these links between the past and the present, right? And to a certain extent, one of the we have to link people who are doing history in one time period with the successive histories and how these are connected. You know, I teach in my cultural anthropology class. You know, we move all the way up to Michelle Alexander, right? And the discussions of the new Jim Crow today, and how is that connected? One of the things I would put though as a challenge for, you know, for those who are interested in this in research, one of my original training was as a cultural anthropologist, archaeologist, and as a demographer, which I realize is a very sort of strange connection. But you know, there are just as we can find art by somebody who was enslaved. It's amazing that some of the data sets that are out there that could possibly be used by people who are in demography or in public health. You know, I'm reminded, for example, of the work that volunteers in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands, George Tyson. They've actually traced for thousands of people, the age, the mortality and so forth for people from disembarking from slave ships to now.
Wow.
If somebody's looking to if somebody's looking to take sort of these general histories and do the kind of work that historical demographers have done to demonstrate what we know to be true, right? But to do it in a different way, I think there is data out there that can be used. It's not impossible. I think this is one of the things that we're discovering nowadays as sort of new data sets come forward, that the possibilities of sort of giving more sort of empirical substance to what we know to be true is out there for those who, for those PhD students who are looking for that project. Flag this one, and there are probably others too.
Ms. Carter?
Yes, yes. So Dr. Stephen, we have some scholars on the line. They're in high school. So what advice would you give to them? They're saying, oh my goodness, I want to be like Dr. Stephen. I want to do this. What advice would you give?
Well, the first advice is I say, come speak to my 16-year-old daughter, and she may disabuse you of whether you want to be like me. She has, though she does dive, I have to say. I think it's so interesting. I think nowadays you have such an opportunity with the internet. There's so many ways in which you can explore this. I think in first instance to really dive deeply into the reading that's available, to look for, there's so many resources and opportunities online, and this is something that the project itself is trying to think about. We've discussed, I'll provide the link. You can go to the story map. It's a digital exhibition that'll walk you through the entire story of the San Jose, but it'll walk you then through the story of the people who are doing the research on the San Jose and how they go about in doing it. And I think, I think it just ultimately be persistent. It's be persistent, and keep pushing forward in terms of don't let people tell you that it's not possible. The shipwrecks project is interesting because it's very interesting now that everybody seems to be sort of interested in this, but I like to remind people that for 8 years, I think I heard no and carried that around in a folder like this, and heard no from, I couldn't even count the number of places, until the Ford Foundation finally said, after saying no 3 times, yes, so if you believe that this is important, be persistent and pursue it, right? And sooner or later, those who stay in the arena will find that an opportunity comes to go forward. We're hoping to do something in the next few years. It's actually an idea we floated some time ago called a virtual field trip. Not everybody can dive, but it would be, we now have the technology that allows people to come on a dive with us virtually and see the research, but also dive in some sense into the past.
I love it.
Yeah, this is something that we're hoping. It's again, I think it was an idea that was put forward 4 years ago, and they were like, virtual, nobody does virtual. Of course, now on this side of the pandemic, everybody does virtual, right? Yeah. So, but I think that find I'll be glad to share a reading list and reach out and be persistent.
Also, before we close, I think I'm going to toss it to you, Ms. Carter, at the end, but wanted to also share for the young people some resources right here in DC. First of all, there is the African American Museum, which is spectacular, and you can learn a lot about the history of slavery, as well as just other African American history, but also there is at the Natural History Museum the curious section. They even have a section for children under the age of 8, I believe, and one's for older kids. This actually, when the Natural History Museum, when they got rid of books essentially and digitized them, this became available. So there are scientists that are on staff and available to talk with young people. There are something like 400 architects. And what's also cool is that, just like you were mentioning, Dr. Stephen, there are actually videos that are about these different scientists so that kids can learn how did they get interested in this field as a child? You know, what sparked their curiosity? What was the educational path, and ultimately what they're doing? And it's on a variety of topics. And they've actually had field trips for kids where they were in touch with maritime scientists in the North Atlantic and got to see what they're doing. So there are lots of resources, and we're lucky in DC that there are so many. So I'm going to say thank you, Dr. Stephen, but I'm going to have Ms. Ashanti kind of close it out for us.
Yes, thank you so much. You pricked my ears, Dr. Stephen, in the beginning when you said that the captain stated, oh, all lives were saved, right? So that takes me back to the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And people want to cry, all lives matter. But I will say, until Black Lives Matter, then all lives will matter. And we saw that with the history. So thank you so much for bringing us to the past as we can make our way to the future. So I'm going to toss it to you, Dr. Stephen. Any last words?
No, I think you've made a connection, an explicit connection that I will certainly, you stated so eloquently. I'll have to use this going forward, because we see that, in 1794, there was a need to recognize that Black Lives Matter, right? And because they certainly did. Here we are 225 years later. And the fact that we need a Black Lives Matter movement says something about how far we haven't necessarily come, even though formally enslavement may not be with us. The legacy is here. And this project should be not just about the past, but what can it speak to the present. And thank you for making that connection.
Oh, thank you for the great work that you do. And thank everyone for joining us. Let's give Dr. Stephen a round of applause. Woo!
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Well, and for the audience, if you want to share this, we're going to put this on our website. It may take a little bit of time to get on our website, but this is such a powerful, powerful webinar that we really want to share it with others. Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you,
appreciate
everyone.
the opportunity. Take care.
All right, good night.
Bye.